Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. How are you? I just want to do this quick video for you just to introduce the idea of American imperialism, some of the context around its beginning. Certainly we'll get to explore a little bit more in terms of some case studies about American imperialism. It happens in a variety of different ways, in a variety of different places, and so some of the case studies we look at will help us define what imperialism even is. But one case study we will look at is the Spanish-American War. This video is more of an introduction to imperialism in general, and we'll get into the Spanish-American War a little bit in the future. One thing that I think is important just to note is that imperialism isn't necessarily new upon the turn of the century. So we might attach it to the likes of Teddy Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson, Taft, these quote unquote progressive presidents, but we often will see imperialism come up, much earlier. And certainly this particular painting, which is something that we've looked at in class already from 1872, kind of gives an impression of how people saw manifest destiny and this idea of Western expansion as maybe significant to the idea, of American progress. And certainly we could look at this through the lens of imperialism as well and question, what is this really about? This also is described by some historians as settlement colonialism. In other words, this is really about taking territorial land largely from indigenous populations, a wide variety of different tribal groups, in some cases losing land to unfair treaty terms, in some cases losing land to outright military conflict and the U.S. military fighting forces that might have been representative of different tribal groups, in some cases some other incidences of localized violence, so all kinds of ways, and the railroads, of course, the building of the railroads and the effect on bison and livelihood of Native Americans in the plains, these variety of different things that were happening throughout the 1800s and especially in the later 1800s is certainly part of the imperialism topic. So it's not new with the 1890s. It's something that had been ongoing in some of the ways in which the United States government negotiated and in some cases took land from or affected indigenous populations. Some of those same methods and plans will be used on colonized populations, that are not necessarily within the borders of the United States. So it's just kind of useful to have some of that, in your mind. A couple of reasons for this time period being a focus of U.S. expansion. And when I say this time period, I really mean kind of this end of the Gilded Age, this time period where industrialization is really growing, and also where we see high rates of immigration and a movement into the progressive era, right? Ways to solve some of these issues that industrialization had brought. Some of the things that are also happening, some of the economic issues that are building are notable in the time period. One that we can note, and you see the image of Frederick Jackson Turner, he's an historian who's writing in the 1890s, and he writes this essay called The Significance of the Frontier in History. And he argues that Western expansion is very connected to American identity. And so the idea that Americans had moved west, claimed some of that land, and then created expansion in an industrial format, some of that lends itself to American-like exceptionalism. And what's something unique in 1890 is that now the United States has colonized essentially sea to sea. So Turner's big takeaway is there's no more Western expansion to be had. So as a result, there is going to be no more gains in terms of identity. What has been like a core American tradition, this idea of quote unquote progress, that's something that needs to be maintained. Of course, driving this is going to be corporations, industrialization, and the idea that new markets could be available. In particular, that's going to be the market of China. The Society of China becomes very much on corporate minds, and that becomes something that is luring corporations into looking at the other side of the world, and also competition with other countries. So the United States starting to create industrial capacity, not only seeking seeking out raw materials or looking to sell goods to new markets, but also looking to compete in some ways with some of the resources of countries like Great Britain or France. So there is, in a sense, an interest in the United States becoming one of the imperial players. And of course, this is ongoing with countries in Europe. If you look, for example, this is a map of 1900. You can just take a quick look at Africa at this point in time, and you can see how much of the continent of Africa has been politically broken up and then colonized by France, by Germany, by Great Britain, by Belgium. So you can see kind of the color coding in the map where it's purple. We have, Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, where we might see the Union of South Africa, German Southwest Africa, claims that European countries are making. So this idea of imperialism had been ongoing for some time in Europe, and the United States, in a sense, is getting into some of this. It does fit with the idea of social Darwinism, which is very much kind of connected to this notion of white superiority, white supremacy. There is a poet by the name of Rudyard Kipling who coins a poem in 1899. He's not American, he's actually English, but he's talking about taking up the white man's burden. This idea of colonizing, but then colonizing through a process of trying to colonize on one hand and yet Christianize, or in some cases bring to the society to make societies that are colonized, basically, less barbaric. So this idea of, there being some justification that countries that are colonizing other countries, exploiting other countries, in some cases extracting resources from other countries and taking those resources for economic value. Some of those types of activities are largely done for the purpose of, trying, the justification is that people will be better off, with this having been done. And Americans are going to buy in to some of that argument. Not all Americans will be imperialists, but it becomes like a political faction of sorts. Many people will be imperialists, including American leaders, and this fits in with this idea of social Darwinism, where there becomes, in a sense, a civilizing process that includes the entire world. So rather than people kind of fighting it out to see which is the strongest, it comes down to nations that are going to be, strong or weak. And on a variety of different criteria, Americans are going to start assessing, other nations and where Americans are strong and other nations are weak. There's another influence. Somebody named Alfred Mahan is going to publish a work, and he's an admiral, so he's actually got like a naval background. He basically makes this kind of significant push for an American naval presence, and he suggests that this new world order that is now going to be very global and very, very maritime, in order for the United States to carry any weight with any other society, there needs to be a Navy that is going to be able to protect the United States, but also send goods and send resources and protect resources that might be located elsewhere in the world. So this idea of having a very significant Navy, offensive battleships, the way that ships could be lightly armored, especially fast, is going to be able to be more on par with some of the European countries, and it creates an interest. If there's going to be economic activity in other parts of the world, the Navy is going to come to protect some of those interests and ultimately serve in that capacity. And so the U.S. Navy, under Teddy Roosevelt and even before, will see a great deal of enhancement. And this is actually, the Navy at one point will take all of their ships and, sail across the world to kind of show off the American naval capacity, right? And this is, around the time period of the early 1900s. The United States does take on ultimately a purchase of Alaska. So you can look at this as kind of an interest that the United States has. Alaska is like literally purchased for a song from Russia. And of course, you can see here how large the state of Alaska will be in 1867. So this is right after the U.S. Civil War. Alaska is purchased for about $7 million. And there is even plans at this time. So even under, Lincoln's presidency and Andrew Johnson's presidency, there's hope to acquire Canada and Mexico for the United States. So Americans are thinking outward, okay? And certainly there becomes interest in Hawaii. Hawaii sees people who are interested in speculating and getting involved in business in Hawaii, especially in agricultural products. There's also missionaries, individuals who are Christianizing. They're interested in Hawaii. By the 1870s, some of the most moneyed people in Hawaii are white Americans who have created sugar plantations and largely used immigrant labor from Asia on these sugar plantations. So these sugar and fruit plantations, like pineapples, for example, this is representative of like maybe 5% of the Hawaiian population. This is not settlement colonialism. This is more what's called extraction colonialism, using the land of Hawaii for access to China, for example, as well as access to land that can then be dominated by white planters and used, exclusively. And we see U.S. Getting involved. The U.S. planters in 1891 will lead an overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani. This has several layers to it. And if you watch the video, the TEDx video, and check out the Brinkley text, you'll see some of the details about Hawaii. But this largely is kind of a corporate-led republic where American businesses, Dole, as in Dole Pineapple, will be leading, in a sense, what is a forced takeover of Hawaii. And to this day, within the state of Hawaii, there's a great deal of native Hawaiians who are very resentful of this American taking of land. And ultimately, Hawaii does become a state, but you can see here the Secretary of State under President Harrison. The Hawaiian pear is now fully ripe. This is the golden hour for the United States to pluck it. If you look at the location of Hawaii on this map, you can see access directly to China. Also on the map, you can note, Samoa and Guam and some of the other areas that the United States will imperialize. So if we ask the question, why Hawaii, it does become of interest not only to the planters who are making money off the sugar, but also to the U.S. government, which is interested in expanding its Navy. And one of the first things that will go in Hawaii, of course, is Pearl Harbor. A lot of this imperialism is going to be about naval and military bases, right? Which is what oftentimes these areas are, Pearl Harbor is still present, of course. We know the story of that. And, we would see the same thing in Cuba with Guantanamo Bay. It's acquired during this time period. Lastly, you can see some of the detail with some of where Hawaii is, how close, in a sense, it is, not only to the United States, but how it might be a route, on the way to Guam and the Philippines and to China. And these are all places where American imperialism will lead to. Samoa is a little bit south, okay? So just kind of note some of that. And we will, tomorrow in class, start to talk about the Spanish-American War. Be well.